Hi, it's Simon here from Analog Anorak. In this video, I'm going to cover 10 of the highlights of the early output from Decca's digital recording system. I've chosen 10 that were recorded between the years 1980 and 1984. As you're probably aware, my own personal preferences tend towards listening to vinyl records. And over the years, I have managed to collect quite a large number of these recordings in vinyl format. While looking into the Decca recording system, I have also relied on the box set over here, the Decca Sound, which did have a significant proportion of CDs that were from the digital recording system period. I do think that quite a lot of what I'm going to chat about is relevant to people who do collect these recordings in the intended CD format. Nowadays, the vinyl versions of digital recordings do have a pretty lousy reputation, but I do think that there are some great sounding ones out there. As well as mentioning 10 specific recordings that I recommend, I am also going to give a few tips and suggestions in relation to the actual, in relation to particular venues and particular recording engineers that in the earliest days do seem to get the most out of the limitations of the earliest form 1.0 of the Decca recording system. Its bare bones are retained over the next 17 years, but there were changes over time. Some of these, I'm sure, were down to learning from experience and slightly tweaking techniques over time. There also was a well-known tradition amongst Decca engineers to tweak existing equipment, and these little modifications did seem to get the most out of the equipment. But also, as time went by, there were significant upgrades of some of the parts of the recording chain. The earliest significant upgrade within the first year or two of recording, where the analog to digital converter was upgraded from the 16-bit version to the 18-bit version. And this was really important because the whole of the Decca recording system had been designed with 18-bit in mind. Before we get going on the 10, I do want to talk about 1979. This was the first complete year of recording in digital by Decca. And I'm afraid that after a very promising start with the release of the double album of the New Year's Day concert, a large proportion of the 1979 recordings are not exactly vintage. I want to stress this because the hype about digital was at its highest in the late 70s, early 80s. So the record companies did manage to shift a lot of digital vinyl during that period. So you do tend to come across a lot of these really early vinyl records in secondhand record stores or charity shops. And I do think that they are best avoided, particularly at the beginning. And I do think it's worth seeking out the slightly rarer, later vinyl versions if you're going to get a better understanding of what these vinyl records can and can't do. This vinyl double album received at the time a fairly warm reception with decent sales and a pretty favourable critical response. And my suspicion is that part of the reason why this is actually a lot more pleasant to listen to is that its hybrid format, which includes two significant analog stages, does have a little bit of a benign effect on the limitations of the very early digital sound. This one in particular, because it was rushed out, it still had the advantage of the end of the vinyl chain being the New Malden pressing factory. New Malden did have a really nice warm sound to it. And only a few of the early digital records went through New Malden because of the polygram takeover. The first couple of years of vinyl production by polygram were a bit disappointing and variable in quality. The earliest ones, like this one, are pretty easy to spot. They have a really pronounced digital branding, and they also, whether it's the SXDL or the LDR United States version, it's got this distinctive light blue label, which a few years later was superseded by a mainly silver label that I personally prefer the sound quality of. In addition to the changeover in pressing factory, there are certainly also some issues around what went on in 1979, because it was a bit of an odd whistle-stop tour around the world of different venues. The sessions being so short that there was really no chance for the teams involved to assess and improve. So very little progress was made during 1979 while they shot around to different locations, including Switzerland, the United Kingdom, various parts of the United States, and Israel. At the tail end of 1979, however, the recording system moved back to the Sophiensaal, where they'd done that initial session just before the New Year's Day concert. They started to go back to the more usual, longer, more considered sessions, and you do start to get a sense of continuation into the 80s, of some steady progress and learning and improvements in the quality of the sound. The format of my 10 highlights is going to be a more considered, slower tour of some of the notable recording venues from the early 1980s. I've also tried to roughly preserve the chronological order of the recording sessions between 1980 and 1984, as there definitely is a sense of evolution of the quality of the sound. It's also worked out that the 10 recordings are nicely bookended by recordings by Dorati with the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. So record number 1 was recorded in Detroit in June 1980. The Detroit sessions were a mixture of analog and digital recording, but nearly all of them took place in the United Artists Auditorium. Decca engineers had searched around in Detroit to find a great sounding recording venue. And they had found that despite its terminal stage of decline by this period, it had still preserved the best sounding acoustics in Detroit. The digital recording sessions by Dorati and Detroit were a definite move on in the right direction compared with 79, but they still have a sense of close but no cigar. This is ironically due to competition by Dorati. First of all, there's Decca Analog Dorati, in the analog setup that they used in the same location, of course, had been developed over several decades and had reached a point of finesse. So you do find that the recordings that were done in an analog style around the same period of time are a much more pleasurable listen. Also, several of the pieces that were chosen for Dorati to do a digital update of were from the golden period of the highest level of achievement by Mercury Records. But this wasn't the case for all of the recordings, and he did record in digital some unique and really lovely sounding recordings. And for me, I think the best of these unique recordings is this one. It's Dvorak's Czech Suite and Waltzes. These beautifully played, charming pieces make a really special record. It's absolutely jam-packed, full of melody, and absolutely great fun. The other thing is that the sonics of this record seem to be a cut above the sonics from the other recordings that were done around this time. In contrast to most of the recordings that were done by the Decca legend Jimmy Locke, this one was done by recording engineer Colin Moorfoot. He's not somebody who really stood out for me before I looked into digital recordings, but as I listened to a lot and selected out my favourite, his name crops up time and time again. I don't know a huge amount about Colin Moorfoot. He seemed to start working with Decca around the mid-60s, and he did spend a lot of time working with Jimmy Locke. But the quality of his style of recording does sound different to Locke. It reminds me a bit to the style of recording by Gordon Parry. And for some reason, his style of recording just seems to gel better with the limitations of early Decca Digital recordings. We'll head north now across the border to Montreal for records 2 and 3. These two recordings are early sessions from Charles Dutoit and the Orchestre Symphonique de Montreal. This collaboration appeared to come almost from nowhere, quickly becoming a cultural and commercial juggernaut. There are certainly no prizes for guessing the first highlight recommendation. It's from the earliest recording session in July 1980, and it's this one. It's of Ravel's complete Daphnis and Chloe. This turned out to be a huge commercial and critical success. I think it was the first digital recording that really lived up to the hype and promise of what could be achieved with this format. It had a very warm reception for the vinyl release in 1981, and an even bigger reaction when the CD came out in 1983. On both formats, the superb performance delivers an intoxicating, sumptuous sound. In some ways, this first recording became for Dutoit a bit of a Citizen Kane, unrealistically high benchmark for all of his later work to be compared with. This one sold in both formats by the shed load, so it's extremely easy to get copies of either. I listened to a few copies on vinyl. My recommendation is that the later 1984 re-release on vinyl with the silver label, for me, has the edge on the original blue label. The second chosen Montreal recording session is this one, which was recorded almost exactly a year later in July 81. It was the second collaboration between the OSM, Dutoit and Kyunghwa Chung. Chung had recorded over the previous 7 years most of her definitive performances on Decca's analog format. I particularly think that the second recording with Chung of Tchaikovsky and Mendelssohn's violin concerto really holds its own against that body of work. It combines great sonics with superb performances. The Tchaikovsky is a strong digital remake of an earlier Decca analog performance, but I must say that for me, the Mendelssohn is really where the action is. The Mendelssohn is a dazzling, light and nimble performance. So the success and fame around the Montreal performances does mean that there's more information to explain why there is this leap forward compared with the sound from Detroit. It appears likely that the choice of superb brand new venue was part of the reason. Head engineer Jimmy Locke had searched around and rejected about 20 different recording venues in Montreal before he got a tip-off about visiting the Church of St. Eustache. Its appearance, including an ornate domed ceiling, resembled a mini Kingsway Hall. So this was quite a promising start, and when Locke clapped his hands and heard the results, he knew that his search was over. To go alongside this venue, they managed to get the perfect choice of recording engineer John Dunkerley had had extensive experience of working alongside Kenneth Wilkinson, often in Kingsway Hall. Dunkerley had managed to master the really quite tricky skill set involved with using Wilkinson's final incarnation of the Decca Tree, which utilised, rather than 5, 4 microphones. There was a central pair of microphones rather than the trio used with the usual form, alongside the 2 outrigger microphones. Now, unlike the 5 microphone Decca Tree, which if set up to the correct specifications almost worked itself, the 4 microphone technique was all sorted out on the console and involved and required a really good understanding and ability to balance the picture. But if done well, it provided superb clarity with really rich sounding low frequencies. Dunkerley has stated that for nearly all of the St. Eustache recordings, he used the 4 microphone technique. And I suspect that his mastery of this technique is the reason why the Ravel recording stood up so well to the really quite relentless scrutiny of early digital recording techniques. We're crossing the Atlantic now, as I'm going to discuss a legendary venue from the Netherlands. The next 3 recording sessions I'm covering were all recorded in Amsterdam between late 1980 and early 1983. They all feature the legendary Concertgebouw Orchestra. I first want to stress how historic was this very happy reunion between Decca and the Concertgebouw Orchestra and its venue. Their original collaboration had occurred in the mono years between 1946 and 1953. The quality of the resulting recordings for that period were outstanding and helped establish Decca on the map and spread the fame of this legendary orchestra. Important contributors to the early success included the conductor Edward van Beinum, also one of Decca's early producers, Victor Olof, and a certain recording engineer, Kenneth Wilkinson. However, it was actually Arthur Haddy in one of the first sessions who made the important discovery that the ideal recording position for the orchestra was to actually strip out the seating and put the orchestra right bang in the middle of the hall. It was certainly a big loss to Decca when the Concertgebouw switched to Philips in the mid-1950s. A brief reunion took place in 1961 after it was discovered that in the mono years, Decca had paid for a couple of sessions that it hadn't used. So they used this opportunity to record the Concertgebouw in stereo, and the engineer again was Kenneth Wilkinson. I think particularly one of these recordings, the Fistulari conducting the Highlights from Swan Lake record, really sounds glorious in stereo. And it does hint at what might have been achieved in a different timeline. Fast forward now to November 1980. Ashkenazy was due to conduct the first Decca Concertgebouw recording session for nearly 2 decades. The piece chosen for this first session was Rachmaninoff's Third Symphony. It's a fascinating fusion of high emotion and lush melodies. It seemed to be a fusion of influences from Tchaikovsky with later ones from Gershwin. Also, I'm sure it was not a coincidence that the recording engineer chosen for this session was none other than Kenneth Wilkinson. Even more poignant, really, was Wilkinson's swan song with his last ever recording for Decca. I wonder whether the down-to-earth, matter-of-fact Wilkinson was influenced by the occasion, because it's lovely to hear some beautiful sonic results achieved in this session. Does it match the golden age stereo results of the Fistulari recording from '61? Probably not. But it's certainly so much better than Wilkinson's very early attempt with digital equipment. The fairly mediocre sounding Sibelius Second Symphony, recorded in 1979 at Kingsway Hall. So this record isn't just a really fine sounding digital recording, it's a lovely digital coda to a legendary engineer's analog career. Record number 5 is from the same Ashkenazy Concertgebouw Rachmaninov series of recordings, including the Symphony Cycle and some other major works. This particular record from the set did have especially high acclaim for the passionate, accomplished performances and the lush sonics. As far as recording engineers, this session actually included a collaboration between the two notable engineers, John Dunkerley and Colin Moorfoot, and this predictably produced two lovely sounding sides. The two compositions, Symphonic Dances and Isle of the Dead, both seem to have the spectre of death hanging above them, but this influence produces very different results. With Isle of the Dead, death seems to have a very oppressive influence over the sound of the piece. In contrast, with Symphonic Dances, with Rachmaninoff's last ever composition before he died, impending death seemed to produce this final wave of energy and creativity. I think this is the only digital vinyl set that has consistent levels of sonics and performance. And I think a lot of this is to do with it starting relatively late and hence not being affected by the iffy 1979 issues. Symphony No. 8 was recorded by the Concertgebouw in December 1982. This is from the Haitink Shostakovich Symphony Cycle. It was released on vinyl in September 1983, and its SXDL number 7621 is one of the very last that was used as part of this series. Around the time that this was released on vinyl, CD versions were getting closer and closer to the vinyl versions, and because of this, Polygram decided to change over to each recording having a single serial number with just a different number indicating which format, whether it was tape cassette, CD or vinyl. It's another recording engineered by Colin Moorfoot with great sonic results, and it's one of the highlights of this famous Haitink set due to a fabulous performance and absolutely stunning sonics. This war symphony includes some jaw-dropping moments of shock and awe, followed by some heart-wrenching depictions of relative calm caused by utter destruction and stunned trauma. The Haitink set overall spans the analog to digital period, including the iffy 79 period. It also spans two different orchestras and venues. I was lucky enough to pick up a few of the digital and analog recordings before the prices went completely insane, especially for a complete set. But the main reason complete sets hang around on eBay forever is that for this particular set on vinyl, it's best to cherry pick anyway. I can certainly vouch for Symphony 8 being an audiophile monster. I also do have a copy on vinyl of Symphony 5, which is excellent, but comparing the two, 8 stands out. Certainly as far as getting the complete set, the only sane way is to buy the set on CD. So I hope you've enjoyed part 1 of this digital highlights. There are 4 more records and recording venues to discuss in the second part, and also a few more issues to cover as far as digital recording and comparing CDs and vinyl. So until then, take care. Bye.